Now, sometimes you're presented with two options, and it's a big decision. Maybe it's two jobs. Maybe you have a teenager that's about to hit college, and you're trying to figure out where is the college for them, or maybe there's a great big decision like Papacitos or Lupe Tortilla. I mean, I really thought, I found out a few months ago, if you weren't here, that our church family is passionate about their Tex-Mex, okay? I could say things about politics or colleges or whatever. I wouldn't get as many emails, suggestions, corrections that I got when I said that one was better than the other. But decisions, sometimes you're presented with two people giving you totally different stories. If you have more than one child, sometimes you'll have two children come to you and go, she did it, he did it, and they're two opposing stories. And you have to play the judge. You have to play the person who's going to say, well, I'm going to listen to all the sides, and I'm going to really absorb all the information. I'm going to try to figure out who is right. And sometimes there's not a right answer or a wrong answer. If you're trying to decide between two jobs, you're just praying for the best. But if you ever have to decide between what is best, then you need really the discernment, the prayer, and really the help from God of what Scripture has to say. And this morning, as we've looked at these face-to-face encounters with God, we've looked at Nicodemus who approached Jesus at nighttime. We looked at the woman of the well that Jesus approached her. We looked at Mary and Martha that they were serving and learning and worshiping from Jesus. This morning, we have a character that has a face-to-face encounter with Jesus, the Messiah, but it's thrust upon him. And in fact, as it is forced upon him, this man is forced not only to make a decision between right and wrong, but really he's forced into the pages of history. Pontius Pilate, when you say those words, you think of the villains, the evil, the wrongdoers. Pilate woke up one morning and had no idea that he would be a name that would be remembered for eternity. And so this morning, as we look at a face-to-face encounter, we look at really the only person that we would think is a villain. But when Pilate decides really between the crowd or the king, the mob or the Messiah, we need to look at his thought process and we need to learn from that, because oftentimes we have to choose between the crowd and the king, the mob and the Messiah. And so that as we learn from what he did and how he investigated and searched for truth, we can be better equipped to approach life, because even 2,000 years later, the crowd is still loud. So let's look at, just as Pilate sits on his throne as really the governor of that region and the judge that had to decide, he wakes up one morning to a mob that is bringing to him a man with all of these accusations. And so he asks them several questions. Just scrolling through this, and by the way, we're going to be in John chapter 18. We're going to start off in 28, but I'm going to be filtering through that all the way into chapter 19. All four accounts give the trial of Pilate. We'll be looking at what the other authors say as well, but really the main portion of our scripture is John 18 and 19. He starts off, basically we'll read from 18:28, and we'll look at his first question. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early in the morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium lest they should be defiled, but they may not eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Pilate has to decide. And so the first question is, what accusation, what proof, what are you charging this man with that you're bringing this man to me on a Friday morning at the crack of dawn? What accusations do you bring? And then he basically says, then why don't you take him and judge him yourself? Why don't you crucify him? If you're so opposed to his teaching, why don't you do that? And then he continues to say, I don't find any fault, but this is really what he looks at, and he sees the crowd. And I want to describe the crowd for you this morning. As you judge between the Messiah and the mob, the crowd and the king, I want you to understand that the crowd that Pilate questioned is the same crowd that continues to scream and try to really engage us and persuade us to follow them. The crowd, first and foremost, was irrational. I love that. There's two things that really make them incredibly irrational. First of all, they wouldn't go into the praetorium, the area where Pilate had his court, because they were worried that they were going to defile themselves, because man-made law said that you could not enter a Gentile's living room or quarters. Otherwise, you would be unclean and not willing to participate or not able to participate in their rituals. These are men who are falsely accusing and about to kill an innocent man. And yet they're worried that the location from the courtyard to the praetorium is going to make them unclean, so they cannot take the Passover. It's ridiculous to see the hypocrisy and the fact that they're about to lie and to accuse and to kill a man, but yet they won't walk into a certain room because that's going to make them unclean. Irrational. And then he asked them that question. Look at their response. Their response is extremely irrational. It says, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" They answered him and said, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." There's no accusation. There's no accusing. They basically said, of course he's guilty or we wouldn't bring him to you. Now just picture in a modern day courtroom. Opening statements, Your Honor. Yes, he's obviously guilty or we wouldn't have arrested him. And then sit down and be done. That is so extremely irrational that they said, Pilate, of course he's guilty or we would not have woken you up and brought him to this trial. That is not good logic. That is not good debate. That is right there. You would fire your attorney like that. But that's the illogical accusation. Well, of course he's guilty, Pilate, or we wouldn't have brought him to you. Not only were they irrational, but they were also self-centered. Everything that the religious leaders did when they accused Jesus had nothing to do with the government, had nothing to do with, he's starting this revolt. It had everything to do with Jesus basically trying to take the way that they lived and alter it and change it. He threatened their lifestyle. He threatened what they held deeply in their heart. He threatened their traditions and their ways, and they were ready to kill him for it. It was self-centered. The crowd was filled with lies. The previous trials, Pilate is really kind of the third trial that's happening. They go to one high priest, and they go to the high priest's father-in-law, and they go back to the high priest, and then they take him to Pilate. Pilate actually tries to pass him off to another person. It is a series of about 5 trials within a few hours. And these trials, when you read all 4 of the Gospels, these trials are filled with lies and false accusations and false testimonies. Nothing of what they say about Jesus is based on truth. It's all based on a convenient lie so that they can push their agenda and so they can see this man, this king who threatens their lifestyle, who threatens their way of life, see him killed, eliminated out of the picture. And really the final thing of the crowd is the fact that they were filled with anger and hatred. And as Pilate tries to present to them some logic and some rational thought and some ability to approach this situation with justice, they simply scream and yell louder, "Crucify." The hatred that they have in their heart toward truth, toward love, toward forgiveness, drives them to crucifying the only innocent man that's ever walked the earth. The crowd is irrational, self-centered, full of lies and hatred, and so much in them that they are crying out and really just presenting to Pilate the worst possible case ever presented. And Pilate, sitting on the throne, says, okay, I've heard from the crowd. Now I need to hear from this man. And so Pilate approaches Jesus. And I love the dialogue between Pilate and Jesus. By the way, Jesus is in the inner room that the outside, they wouldn't go in because it would defile them. Jesus was hanging out. So Pilate is going outside talking to the crowd, going inside talking to Jesus, going outside talking to the crowd, and back inside talking to Jesus. And he walks up to Jesus and he asks him simple questions. He starts off with, are you the king of the Jews? Are you the king of the Jews? He cuts right to the chase. Are you the king of the Jews? Let me remind you that it is the Jews that have brought Jesus. It is the Jews that are accusing Jesus. It is the Jews that are demanding the death sentence. And he starts off with, are you their king? And Jesus responds, this is a great response. He says, are you speaking for yourself about me? Or did others tell you this concerning me? See, Jesus wants to know, Pilate, are you really concerned about who I am? Are you investigating for the justice system? Or are you curious and seeking truth for yourself? Because Pilate, regardless of what happens out there, you are truly the one on trial. And the greatest thing about this dialogue between Jesus and Pilate is, it is not Pilate trying Jesus. Jesus continues to put Pilate on trial, saying, Pilate, you're the one that needs the truth, the peace, the forgiveness, the love. You're the one that's going to have to decide, not based on what's going to happen to me ultimately, but based in your heart, are you going to go with the crowd or are you going to go with the king? Is this you personally asking? And Jesus, as he does so well and so often, he answers a question with a question. Is this you? Is this on your own accord? And Pilate, very frustrated, because he answers in 35, says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest have delivered you to me. What have you done? His second question to him is, what have you done? And Jesus' response is so simple. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. He goes back and answers the first question. He says, my kingdom, in verse 36, is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. And Jesus gives him a sneak peek of the fact that, yes, I am a king, but you don't have to be threatened because my kingdom isn't of this world. My servants would be fighting for me if I were a king in this world. Instead, I'm being handed over an innocent man to be judged guilty. And then Pilate says, are you then a king? Are you a king then? He questions, okay, you're a king, you're admitting to this. And then Jesus gives the right thing. He says, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born. For this cause I have come into the world. Now stop right there. When you read that, understand that Jesus is about to give Pilate and us his mission statement in life. This is why I was born. This is why I've been walking around on the earth. He says, do you want to know why I'm here? Yeah, you think I'm a king? That's not important. This is why I was born. This is why I walked on this earth. If you want to know why Jesus came, he's about to tell Pilate and he's about to tell us. He says, for this I have come to the world that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Now, the irony is crazy in this because Jesus is in a trial filled with lies and false testimonies. Jesus is standing before the man who's going to judge him either innocent or guilty. Jesus is standing there and he says, you know why I've come? To testify to truth. So that anyone who is of me, anyone that follows me, who accepts me, who walks with me, hears and understands the truth. Truth is why Jesus came. In fact, John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus says, I am the truth. Jesus says, my Father is truth. He says, the Spirit is the Spirit of truth. I am all about truth. Absolute, guaranteed, 100% truth. And then in our modern world, in fact, on Monday and Tuesday, this is where the whole sermon was going to land. And I just, through praying and wrestling with it, we switched it to really look at Pilate's overall judgment of Jesus. But Pilate responds with a very modern, this could be 2019. In verse 38, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, so basically Pilate looked at him, looked at the incarnated God, the embodiment of truth. And Jesus says, I have come to highlight truth. I have come to share truth. I am truth. And Pilate looks at him in a postmodern philosophy thought and says, what is truth? And walks out. People have debated whether or not he was really reflective. What is truth? I think it was more of a flippant, what is truth? Because then he turns and walks out, doesn't wait for a response, doesn't wait for Jesus to be able to give him an answer. He just says, what is truth? And he walks out. In our world today, we live in a world where 52% of church-going Christians do not believe in absolute truth. That is astonishing. That is so hurtful to the cause of Jesus Christ and the church in the 21st century. The fact that we think that what is true for you can be true for you and what's true for me is true for me, and they don't have to really line up, that is absolutely a lie and a manipulative plan from the devil himself. The enemy wants for us to go, there's really no black and white, there's no wrong and right. It's just whatever you feel like. And in the last 50 years, our nation has gotten away from absolute truth. That there is right, that there is wrong, that there is a moral compass that says north, and it's north. You can't take a compass and debate whether or not where you want north to be or where you want east to be. You can't debate the laws of gravity. I don't care if I totally don't agree with gravity. I don't believe in gravity. I want gravity to work totally different. If I walk off this stage, I'm falling. That's absolute truth. Absolute truth is why Jesus came. He says, I'm setting a moral standard. I'm setting an opportunity for people to look at what is right. And if you go some different direction, then you're wrong. And in our world that everybody gets a trophy and we want everybody to have great self-esteem, we hate to tell people you're wrong. But when you go against this book, which is absolute truth, and you go against Jesus, who is absolutely true, you are wrong. And that is a statement, that is a banner that we must take up. Because we live in a world where now I'm not talking about the people out that never come to church. They all believe in relativism. They all believe that whatever you want to believe is okay for you, whatever I want to believe is okay for me. Let's just let's be tolerant of everybody. Jesus says, I have come to testify to truth, and anybody that understands me, lives for me, accepts me. You hear truth. And when truth is removed from a nation, chaos ensues. And we need to understand that if we don't stand for absolute truth, that our nation is heading down a path of destruction. We need to stand for absolute truth. Is this Bible true? Absolutely, 100%. Do we love hearing about how we're wrong when we go against this? But no, it's frustrating. No one likes to hear that they're wrong. So when we tell the world that this is true and they're wrong, or this is true and they're going in a wrong direction, we do so in love and grace, but we do so never watering down the true Word of God and His plan for our lives. And yes, if I saw this probably evident in the early 2000s, there was a church in the town where we used to live, a mainstream denomination. Pastor was moved from this town to this town, and it was a denomination that they decided where the pastors go. And this pastor comes in, and we had a great working relationship with 3 or 4 churches, and we do stuff together all the time to get ready for Easter or a Thanksgiving service for the community. And we had this pastor in a mainstream Christian Bible-believing denomination. And my pastor sat down with him and found out that he was a universalist, that as long as if you're a Hindu, as long as you have faith in your Hindu beliefs, you'd get to heaven. If you're Islam, then as long as you followed Allah with your passionate heart, that you'd get there. And my pastor, who understood absolute truth, said to him, John, what about John 14:6? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the pastor looked at him and goes, yeah, that's only true for Christians. I was blown away. This wasn't a college professor. You expect that from a college professor. This wasn't someone who barely darkened the doors of the church. This was a leader of a major denominational church that believed that Jesus was not the only way to heaven. Just let you on a little secret. If Jesus isn't the only way to heaven, then we don't need to be here. Let's just go live life, have fun, and see what happens. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He said it, he lived it, he is the way, the truth, and the life. We have to believe that, and we have to live it. Now, look, because I want to get to the application, because this is so vital to us. Because after he hears the two sides of the story, and Jesus has this, basically everything that he's living, my purpose is to point to truth. He basically says, then you're really not in control. My Father's in control. You wouldn't even have any authority had my Father not given it to you. So Pilate, you're really not even the one that's doing this. It's really the false accusations of the leaders. Then basically we end up with Pilate's verdict. And the other passages, I want to read two other passages. Mark 15:15. It says, wanting to gratify the crowd. Another version says, wishing to please the crowds. And then it all boils down to this. When we get to the verdict, when we get to whether or not we're going to follow the crowd or the king, it comes down to this. Luke 23:23. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. And the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. It boils down to this. The crowd is still loud. The crowd in our culture is still spreading lies. They're being irrational. They're filled with hatred. They're filled with their own self-satisfying goals. And if it doesn't fill their self-satisfying plan or agenda, then they're going to yell even louder. And here's Pilate. Pilate 3 times says this, and I'll just quote it once, but he basically goes out and says, I find no fault in him at all. He says later, he says, I'm bringing him out, and I want you to know that I find no fault in him. Pilate comes out again and says, hey, there's this custom. I can release one prisoner. Shouldn't I release this king of the Jews? Because he's innocent. He's trying to even give the false accusations a way out. And 3 times and 2 more times he tries to get out of this. Pilate's wife even sends him a message and says, have nothing to do with this man's death. Pilate goes out and he washes his hands and says, let his blood be on your heads. I'm washing my hands clean of this. So if you look at Pilate's response, his heart and his voice said Jesus is innocent. But his actions are summed up in verse 16. Then he delivered him. Then Pilate delivered Jesus to them to be crucified. Here's our application. You can believe that Jesus is king in your heart. You can believe in this word all you want. You can even voice that as we sing praises and say he is, and we can't wait, and the Lord is our king. But if your actions say crucify, you are no better than Pilate. If we believe it in our heart and we speak it with our tongues, but we live a life of moral relativism, if we let people understand lies and follow their own path and not stand up for truth, then we are sitting on the seat of judgment and saying, I choose the crowd and I condemn the king. Because the crowd is loud. They are screaming. Just turn on the TV, read your Twitter, or look at the newspaper. The crowd, the culture, the lies, the self-centeredness, the hatred is so loud. And we as a church family need to sit on our judgment seat and understand that we have to choose between the crowd and the king, the mob and the Messiah. And when you live out your life, every decision that you make, every choice that you choose, you're choosing the crowd or the king. You're choosing between truth or just going along with the culture. You're choosing between what is right and what is wrong. There is no middle ground. Pilate is infamous. He's a villain. He's known in history as the one who crucified Jesus. But what are we doing? 2,000 years later in our hearts, as we choose today the crowd or the king? Do we say, yes, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is truth, Jesus is right, he is forgiving, but yet our actions yell crucify? It is time for the church to stand up for truth in action. It is time for us to live out what we believe and what we say and what we sing and what we know that this Bible is true. It's time for us to stand, even when the crowd is shouting, crucify. Will we stand?